cadre, dans le cadre de notre formation en ligne, le cours, sur le cours juste vers la question écologique du travail. En espérant que vous portez bien et vous êtes bien installé où vous vous trouvez, on vous prie tout simplement d'observer cette petite règle. Si vous ne prenez pas la parole cet après-midi, mais votre micro de silence. Si vous pouvez vous présenter au niveau de chatbox, en propose que vous nous suivez, vous pouvez présenter votre nom et après la session ou alors pendant, vous pouvez poser vos questions à ce niveau-là. On aimerait également préciser que cet échange est enregistré pour ceux vraiment qui ne se sentent pas confortables pendant l'enregistrement de cette session. Vraiment, vous pouvez nous informer cela maintenant avant que nous continuions. Ceci dit, je ne sais pas s'il y a une préoccupation à ce niveau. S'il n'y a pas de préoccupation, vous êtes une fois de plus la bienvenue parmi nous. Cette série d'ateliers est la première dans le cadre de notre cours. Et pour cet échange, ce que nous devons savoir, c'est que nous allons recevoir un expert de notre formation en ligne. Et cet expert, comme nous savons, est nul autre que Samantha Mason. Et cet après-midi, elle va nous présenter une thématique qui est vraiment très importante aujourd'hui, la coalition travailliste anti-fracking au Royaume-Uni. Notre expert de cet après-midi est chargé de mission pour la durabilité et le changement climatique au sein du syndicat des services publics et commerciaux PCS au Royaume-Uni. Son travail consiste à aider différents représentants environnementaux sur le lieu de travail et à élaborer des programmes de durabilité. Elle également rédige des notes d'orientation et des documents sur la transition juste. Elle travaille également en étroite collaboration avec des groupes de campagne tels que Extinction Rebellion et les Amis de la Nature. Elle représente le syndicat au sein des initiatives mondiales syndicats pour une démocratie énergétique et de la coalition britannique COP26. Elle est militante à part entière et membre du New Lucas Plan, de la campagne, elle mène des campagnes pour le désarmement nucléaire qui s'intéresse particulièrement à la diversification de la défense et d'un certain nombre de campagnes dans son quartier sur le logement, le changement climatique et l'environnement. Cet après-midi, nous sommes heureux de recevoir Sam Mason. Sam, tu es la bienvenue parmi nous cet après-midi. Sam, tu es la bienvenue parmi nous cet après-midi. Peut-être pour rentrer dans le vif du sujet de cet après-midi, Sam, comme tu peux le constater, nous allons parler de la coalition travailliste anti-fracking au Royaume-Uni. On aimerait un peu savoir qu'est-ce que le fracking d'abord, peut-être, les participants aimeraient savoir qu'est-ce que le fracking et comment cela se manifeste aujourd'hui dans le monde entier. Qu'est-ce qu'on trouve au niveau du Royaume-Uni? Quelles sont ces conséquences de cette activité qui aujourd'hui semble vraiment impacter la nature à cause de cette poussée avancée du désir d'exploitation du gaz dans notre pays? Merci Sam, peut-être on te donne la parole pour ton mot de cet après-midi.
Thank you, Lucia, and bonjour à tous. Really pleased to be able to speak to obviously trade unionists on this course in the Francophone speaking countries as well, which is really good. So I'll just start a little bit about the nature of fracking in the UK, and I presume that you would have read obviously the script, the video lecture, which I did last year. So that's, I think actually slightly even before that, before it was first displayed online as part of the course. So we've had quite a lot of developments since then, but the issue around fracking and opposing fracking in the UK, so that's shale gas hydraulic fracturing, to call it its more technical terms, I suppose. But this goes back to around 2012, the origins of our campaign here. This has particularly been in the northwest of the country, in an area called Lancashire, where it was seen to be sort of fertile for shale gas deposits. So one of the initial issues is, I mean, the initial issue is about climate change and the need to stop fossil fuel extraction. And obviously new fossil fuel projects is how we would talk about it today, if we didn't perhaps talk about it in the same way 10 years ago, but certainly that's how we would talk about it today. And the need to be investing obviously within our renewable energy resources. So fracking is seen as what we call a dirty energy project in the UK, partly because of the techniques which are involved, which means drilling vertically into the ground and then horizontally along, and it's to firing a sort of mix of sand and water with other chemicals into the land, particularly into rock, to release gas which is trapped in the rock. So that's basically what it's about from sort of geological and sort of practical level. So there's about the extraction methods, and there's about the gas itself. So the extraction methods, which are highly debated around the chemicals that go in. So some experts in the UK who support fracking say it's a very small amount of chemicals, they're not dangerous. We disagree with that. But also because of the drilling that happens is also about leakages within the drilling sites itself. So there's other sort of environmental contamination associated with fracking, which we're very concerned about. And some of this we have seen, particularly from the US, obviously, where they've got very developed shale gas fracking happening. And not in the UK. So this is really where the campaign has built from. And it also here causes earth tremors and earthquakes. So around 2012, the first, there was one of the first fracturing, as it's called, that took place, caused a significant earth tremor, which the government then decided there needs to be a moratorium to better test the geology for fracking to take place. So some of that happened, but then in that time we were also building up a campaign, first with environmental activists. Trade unions weren't particularly involved in the beginning, but then we had some activists in that region who were also environmental activists, and then got very concerned about this technique and what it could do. I think also on the other side of this is about democracy and discussion with local populations about the impact of these kind of projects within their communities. So there was local level consultation, because there has to be planning processes that happen. But what happened over the years is that although there was a lot of local opposition, the government actually chose to ignore that, and at many levels. So it started to build a very big movement across the country, because whilst it was happening in the northwest, there was also other parts of the country which were targeted for fracking. And this was led by one particular company called Quadrilla, who the chairman of Quadrilla also had to be heavily involved in North Sea oil and gas production as well, was also very closely aligned to the government. So it was very clear that there was a kind of sort of network there of lobbying of both with politicians and within the industry to force this to go ahead. Now, to some extent also, and as you would have read from the video that I did, or the script from it, or heard from that, the main union that represents in the gas sector, the GMB trade union, it's one of the largest industrial unions in the UK, was also very supportive of fracking, because whilst we didn't have any industry in fracking, they saw that this would be a real job creator. So of course the other side of it was that we disputed very much that this would create lots and lots of jobs. So even if we agreed that it should happen, that we didn't believe that this is where you were going to create jobs, and far more jobs could be created if we invested in our renewable energy sector, particularly in offshore wind. And that area of the UK is very rich in wind resources, and so that there's lots of potential there to exploit, which is now starting to be exploited. But so for us, we needed to be looking then at these alternative strategies. So it's slightly different for when we have our conversations around just transition, of coming out of already invested fossil fuel infrastructure and industry. This was an industry that wasn't yet born, so we didn't have to create these jobs. We weren't displacing or losing jobs. This is about future jobs. So, it's very strange to many of us that this is something that we felt needed to be pursued. And I think, and we also, compared to the US, so of course a lot of the comparisons at the time was what was happening in the US was providing lots of cheap energy with the real oil and gas, shale oil and gas boom in the US. But we also said that the UK, it very much wouldn't happen for us, because we have a very different geology. Obviously the UK, well, I should say Britain, is a small island. It's not a huge, large areas of unpopulated areas such as they had in the US. And the other difference in between particularly the UK and the US is in the US, a lot of it was done on farmland or land where people there owned the land. And so the companies could come in and buy the rights for the mineral extraction from the farmers. That's not possible in the UK. We don't own any of the mineral assets beneath our land. So where I'm sitting right now in my home, if they said there was shale gas beneath it, I wouldn't own that, even if I sort of technically own my home. So that is the property of what we call the Crown Estate, which is actually owned by the Queen under taxation system there. So it's rather more complicated, but it was recognised that it certainly wasn't going to be a cheap source of energy. And probably for us in the UK, so when they found North Sea oil and gas, for example, in the 50s and 60s, and one reason why the UK came out of coal, apart from just wanting to attack the very strong and militant coal miners union, but because they recognised it was a cheaper source of energy. And so we had this dash for gas in the 80s and 90s in North Sea oil and gas. And it did to some extent provide cheaper fuel, but this certainly wasn't going to be the case with shale gas fracking. So over a series of years, we did get to the point in 2019 where the government did announce a moratorium on fracking. Largely, I think many of us saw that as a political move at the time of the election in 2019, because a lot of the areas that had potential for fracking had a lot of opposition from local populations, and a number of those areas had Conservative MPs in them, and they were at risk of not winning those seats in the election. So it was very much a political motivation to some extent. But I think also by that stage, it was becoming very clear. So the limited fracking that had started on a test level, it was clear it wasn't going to be economically viable. So I think for many of us involved in campaigning, we actually felt quite confident at the time that fracking would never happen in the UK, just because they would not be able to make significant amounts of money out of it for the capital investment that would need to go in. So, and I think that to some extent is being borne out now in the very surprise move that we had when Liz Truss, and our ex-Prime Minister, as of this morning, suddenly at the beginning of September overturned the moratorium on fracking, and said that we would have shale gas operations within 6 months, which in and of itself seems to lack any understanding what was needed in terms of the investment, let alone the social license to undertake fracking in any part of, I should say Britain. I'm sorry, I keep saying the UK, and it is important to make a distinction, because within the nations of the UK there are different positions. So there is still moratorium in Scotland, that is it's technically banned in Wales, and also in Northern Ireland. So we're really talking about England here, although they were going to try and impose it in Scotland as well, and the other nations. But we're really probably talking about England. But since Liz Truss, when she made that announcement, interestingly, even the companies that had previously been interested in fracking in the UK said that it was not going to be economically viable, which really stood up to our arguments. And I think the other concern, not just for the UK, but across Europe as well, where the whole energy crisis, and on the back of particularly of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the gas crisis, there has been a renewed debate about whether we should be investing in fracking. And I think, generally speaking, that's whilst there is a need for gas resources, that fracking is not seen as the way forward on that. Or of course there will be different schools of thought that disagree, but even if we wanted to do it, it would take so much time to bring online, and I think there's very little expectation that the reserves that are there could be sort of drawn or produced enough to make it economically viable or make any major contribution to the gas needs across Europe. So I hope that gives a little bit of an overview of where we are for now.
Merci beaucoup, une fois de plus, Sam, pour cette brillante présentation sur la question de facturation, ou alors la coalition travailliste anti-fracking au niveau du Royaume-Uni. On comprend ici aujourd'hui que cette pratique aujourd'hui, bien que nous savons que la course pour le gaz est vraiment énorme dans le monde aujourd'hui, mais cela a des énormes effets sur la santé des humains aujourd'hui. La contamination des eaux, la prolifération des gaz à effet de serre, les acides formiques, tous ces produits utilisés en fait dans ce processus-là a vraiment un impact néfaste sur la santé humaine aujourd'hui. Mais néanmoins, je pense que les questions que les uns et les autres peuvent se poser ici, c'est savoir, est-ce que vous avez une manière alternative en tant que défenseur peut-être de la nature sur comment est-ce qu'on peut davantage extraire le gaz? Parce qu'on sait que c'est un domaine qui aujourd'hui crée de l'emploi à beaucoup de personnes parce qu'il y a de l'argent à l'intérieur. Quelle est l'alternative vraiment qu'on propose pour mieux extraire ce gaz-là? Parce que la méthode fracking n'est pas conseillée parce qu'elle a un impact vraiment sur nos ressources. Quelle est la méthode que vous proposez, une alternative qu'on peut utiliser concrètement pour pouvoir limiter ces effets du fracking en fait?
Thank you. Well, I think We would say that we don't want to extract gas at all. If we are to live within our, global carbon budgets that we need, and of course greenhouse gas emissions are going up, unfortunately, despite the United Nations processes of the COP, so the Coalition of Parties meetings, and obviously the next one being just a few weeks' time in Sharm el-Sheikh in Glasgow. And this is a big debate about whether gas is a transition fuel from fossil fuels into a, if you like, 100% renewable energy economy. So for us, we don't think it is. I think we have to deal with those questions of where it is a big employer and where there's a transitioning out of gas into other forms of energy production. But that's a different question about, can we make gas safe? And this is some of the heart of the debates, which certainly we have here in the UK, that we can produce gas with carbon capture and storage, for example, which I actually find quite terrifying. And of course, again, as always, there are arguments around jobs that can be created in this, but the processes of extracting carbon or capturing the carbon rather, it's hugely expensive. It hasn't been done on a commercial basis anywhere in the world as yet. And I think, that still means us storing the carbon somewhere. The proposals in the UK that we can put that into disused coal mines, we can put it into the pipelines in the North Sea, where the North Sea oil and gas production has been, but also that we can become a trader in it and accept other countries' carbon. But I think it doesn't eliminate the problem. So if we're just going to carry on producing the carbon, and of course methane with it as well, it is extremely complicated. One of the things for us which we consider that we need to strive towards is thinking about what is a very strategic and joined up transition plan for energy, because it's not just as simple as saying, well, we can just have renewables, we can just have this, we can just have that. Obviously things take time, we need to change many things within our systems, and I think particularly when it comes to the power sector and using gas for power generation, then we certainly need to be looking at alternative fuels for that, and building our grid systems to enable it as well. And clearly it's different in which part of the world you're sitting in, and particularly whether you're in the so-called global north versus global south. There are different energy issues and energy challenges, and we're certainly not saying we don't recognize that, but I mean, certainly for our situation here, I think we have alternatives that we should be pursuing rather than what we would call greenwashing of not doing the very difficult and bold things that we need to do. Because I mean, also because if we continue with gas, particularly in power generation, that means we have to continue with a design of our grid systems that are relying on that form of energy. And of course that's a very complicated process in terms of how we design our transmission and distribution grid systems for this as well. And of course in parts of Africa, very much aware, I mean, not just Africa, but particularly parts of Africa where there isn't even access to energy at the moment, then, we need to be conscious of that as well, and about where we really develop alternative jobs and build the jobs that address the issues of climate change. And, it's not a simple question. And as I said in the video lecture, we're part of an initiative, a global initiative of trade unions for energy democracy. And I was just very privileged to be in Nairobi a couple of weeks ago, where that initiative has launched a Global South initiative to look very specifically at the issues that are more pertinent in the global south compared to the global north, and try and bring that into a wider discussion within it, so that we are looking sort of holistically at a global level, and not just sort of one set of orientations that may suit us in the global north, than to the global south, and obviously to try and reinforce that the global south has to be able to pursue its transition in a way which is of benefit to countries in the global south, but also where it's under their own ownership, because very central to that initiative is about seeing energy as a global public good, where it's affordable, had universal access recognised as human rights within that, and the rights to energy for everybody, and also to pursue that development pathway which meets the needs of that country or region, and where we also share technology globally on a basis that enables everybody's transition.
Merci une fois de plus, Masson, pour cette explication vraiment succincte sur ces questions de fracking et comment on peut faire la transition. À présent, nous allons ouvrir la page pour le débat. Nous allons donner la parole à nos différents participants ici présents pour qu'ils puissent poser leurs questions. Peut-être, je vois dans le chat box, là, il y a des questions qui ont été posées par certaines personnes. Je ne sais pas, il serait préférable pour vous peut-être d'ouvrir votre micro si vous pouvez poser votre question directement à notre expert. Je vois là, il y a parmi nous, il y a Lucky qui a posé une question. Si Lucky peut prendre la parole directement et pose sa question à Sam. Il y a également... je vois Ghislain également qui a posé une question. Si Ghislain, peut-être après Yuki, je vois une main levée, oui, peut prendre la parole. Et puis, peut-être après Luki, on prend Ghislain et puis on va prendre Thomas qui a levé la main. Ouvrez votre micro et vous posez la question directement. Est-ce que Ghislain est là? Est-ce que Luki est là?
Oui, qui est là. Vous m'entendez?
Si Luki n'est pas là, on peut prendre Ghislain.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Merci de te présenter avant de poser la question.
Oui, je suis Ghislain, ingénieur agronome et spécialisé dans la gestion des ressources naturelles en République démocratique du Congo, notamment la conservation de la biodiversité et tout ça. Ma question porte sur l'exploitation des gaz et du pétrole. Il y a un projet d'exploitation de ces ressources en RDC, en République démocratique du Congo, dans les réserves naturelles, les réserves naturelles et les aires protégées, les différents parcs du pays. Et j'aimerais savoir s'il y a possibilité d'exploiter ces ressources, le gaz et le pétrole, tout en conservant la biodiversité, les écosystèmes, avec les méthodes qui nous ont été présentées dans cette rencontre et tout ça. C'est un peu ça ma question.
Merci Ghislain. Je crois que Samantha va pouvoir répondre à ta question. Merci. Je crois qu'on peut prendre une question et puis Samantha répond. On prend notre question et répond pour ne pas accumuler, quoi.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ghislain. I was just going to say, I think if you're an engineer in agronomy, you probably know the answer better than me. I'm not an engineer. I have to say I'm a policy specialist, but not technical specialist. But I would just hazard that there wouldn't be a way to actually preserve, to do that level of exploitation and preserve the biodiversity around it, because I think, particularly for shale gas fracturing, as you will probably know, it is kind of presented as though it takes a very small space. It's not destructive because on the surface, it's not like you might see with coal mining, particularly with open cast coal mining. So it can seem to take a small area, but of course, the drilling travels very far underground. So it has come, there is the potential, obviously, of the environmental damage to aquifers and to the soil and leaks and stuff like this. So, and of course, there's all the movements that happen around a site as well. And certainly this is something which we found up in Lancashire with just a very small site. I mean, you've got on very small roads and infrastructure that's not really built for this, with trucks going in and out, which creates enormous other types of environmental damage as well. So I would imagine in a place like the DRC, where I've never been, but so I'm only talking from what I've seen on TV or read in pictures, that that would be an enormous threat to some very unique biodiversity in the area. So whilst obviously there is something to balance in needing to generate income from the energy resources, I think anything that can be done to avoid that type of resource extraction should certainly be done. And also that, the DRC, of course, is an area that's already impacted by, I think it's the cobalt mining. So, I mean, we are very conscious that within the renewable energies area, that brings with it a whole new level of extractivism as well, which, we have to be aware of.
Merci beaucoup, Rassan, pour ces éléments de réponse. Une fois de plus, c'est vrai qu'on a un souci de retour avec l'interprétation, mais je pense que c'est bon. À présent, on va passer la parole à Lucky. Je ne sais pas si Lucky est connecté.
Je suis connecté.
Je vois, elle a posé la question,
ça...
bien, il a posé la question.
Oui.
Je ne sais pas si tu peux prendre la parole maintenant pour reposer ta question directement.
D'accord. OK. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Tu peux ouvrir ton micro, Lucky. Et puis, tu poses ta question.
Alors,
après cela, on va prendre Thomas
et
on va prendre Michael qui a également levé la main.
Oui, alors, mon micro est ouvert. Est-ce que vous arrivez à m'entendre?
On t'entend, on t'entend.
Ah, OK, d'accord. D'accord, alors ma question, d'abord, je me présente.
Ouvre ton micro, Lucky. Ouvre ton micro. Peut-être c'était encore muté.
Ça marche déjà, là.
Fais ouvrir ton micro.
Oui. Alors, je suis Lucky Ndianirin de Madagascar. Je travaille à la Fondation Friedrich Ebert, Madagascar, sur le projet changement climatique. Ma question, en fait, concerne...
je ne sais pas, est-ce qu'on a besoin de suivre Lucky parce que moi, je n'ai pas de retour. S'il n'y a pas de retour de Lucky, je vais prendre Thomas.
On l'entend, Lucky, on l'entend.
Oui, alors.
OK.
D'accord. Je continue. Donc, ma question porte sur un contre-argument qu'on entend souvent en défaveur de l'énergie renouvelable, c'est sur la variabilité en fait des productions, que ce soit le solaire, l'éolien ou l'hydroélectrique, en fonction donc du rythme du vent, du débit des rivières. On a des productions qui peuvent être très différentes. Et ce qui fait donc que quand on a de grands besoins en énergie, c'est compliqué de se satisfaire uniquement des ressources renouvelables. Donc, dans un pays comme le Royaume-Uni, où il y a quand même des besoins assez importants, comment est-ce qu'on peut répondre à ces arguments-là? Merci.
Thank you, Lucky. That's a really important question, and there is no easy answer to that, of course. There is clearly a question about the sun and the wind, and particularly, I think I saw it in your question in the chat, in a country like the UK. I mean, we have a lot of wind resources, That is for sure. But there has been times, when the wind hasn't blown particularly. But I think it's the energy transition, and the way certainly in which we see it, is it has to be seen as part of an energy system. It's not just about the energy inputs. We have to look at the other sides of it, so what we call the distributed energy resources as well, which go alongside it, so the batteries, also reducing our use, thinking about what we use energy for. Certainly, if, as they say, we are going to electrify everything, this would, I think that the statistics are something like tripling of global energy use, and energy use is going up massively at the moment. A lot of that, unfortunately, is actually, so whilst renewable energy is going up, is actually being facilitated through fossil fuels, mainly oil, gas and coal, of course. So, I think we've got some real world big issue discussions here, and certainly we would want to be part of an energy system that is regionally based as well. So we would, so one of the things in the UK, when we've got excess of wind power, for example, we would hope to be exporting it to countries so that they can use it. But, we need to find better ways to store it as well. And these are all sort of real world technical issues that we have to overcome. And I think one of the things, and perhaps that I didn't say earlier, so part of our energy democracy initiative on the global scale is really about calling for public ownership and democratic control of energy, because this is an energy system we need to resolve, and technical questions we need to resolve on a global scale, not just on a national or regional scale. That's whilst they are important as well, but trying to find a way in which we can plan our energy model. And I think in a country like the UK, where we have a wholly privatized energy system that is dependent on the markets, it's dependent on private sector investment, we had this stop-start the whole time about renewable energy and fossil fuels, and we just see that now. Now we just had these political upheavals, so we don't know yet which the new Prime Minister, our third one, this year is going to do. We don't really know what his record is on all these things yet. So he might well come in and call a ban on fracking, which of course would be great. But we do know at the beginning of this Parliament in 2019, when he was the finance minister, he was against the massive programme of retrofit and installation for homes, for example, which would cut an enormous amount of energy use in this country straight away. And everybody's agreed on that. There's really little dissent from that. We might disagree on how that's done, but so he instituted a programme of grants that was then withdrawn quite quickly. So it's this stop, start. So I think whilst there are technical, clear issues about the variability of renewable energy, we need a policy landscape and stable landscape, which is why we argue that has to be done under public ownership, where we can get real planning in place. So we can coordinate, and it's not, what we're seeing at the moment is almost chicken and egg, depending on what the markets think and what the politicians of the day think. Humanity in this global climate crisis we're facing really doesn't have time for this, although of course it's not going to take notice of our stupidities and failings politically, not to take these very serious issues on board. So I mean that's not a great answer, but I think it's these are sort of big issues that we all need to grapple with.
Merci Sam pour cette réponse vraiment profonde. Nous allons maintenant donner la parole à Thomas qui a la main levée depuis. Après Thomas, nous allons prendre Michael.
Alors, merci bien. Bonjour à tout le monde. je suis Thomas Songobis du Cameroun, président national de SNTBC, un syndicat qui conseille et protège les intérêts des travailleurs du bâtiment, travaux publics et bois. Je ne voudrais pas modifier le TDR qui a été donné à Sam pour son exposé. Et nous sommes là dans une thématique qu'on a besoin de comprendre. Et pour moi qui ne suis pas ingénieur ou expert dans le domaine, j'ai voulu rester basique en posant la question. Mais la question de Lucky tout à l'heure m'amène plutôt à faire un commentaire pour dire qu'après lecture, parce que ce que je suis, certains participants le sont aussi, c'est-à-dire que ne sont pas du domaine. Donc, j'ai juste voulu dire que nous sommes là à parler des énergies renouvelables qui, effectivement, renouvelables pour dire que ça trouve le renouvellement dans les variabilités que Lucky a énoncées dans sa question, qui sont les régimes de vent, l'intensité et tous les rayons solaires. Donc, c'est ce que j'ai voulu plutôt dire pour ajouter un commentaire à ce que Sam m'a donné comme réponse à la question de Lucky. Voilà. Merci bien et encore, merci aussi pour l'initiative de nous permettre toujours ce partage d'expérience. Merci encore.
Okay, merci vraiment beaucoup, Thomas, pour ce commentaire à l'endroit de cet atelier. Merci beaucoup. On prend note pour le commentaire et je pense que Sam a également pris des éléments que tu as eu à émettre. À présent, nous allons donner la parole à Michael Boka pour sa question. Michael, tu peux ouvrir ton micro et tu poses la question.
Mon micro est ouvert. Je suis Michael Boka, enseignant, professeur d'anglais, membre du CIRES Côte d'Ivoire, syndicat d'enseignants, membre du comité jeune de la Confédération internationale des syndicats libres, CISL Dignité Côte d'Ivoire. Ma préoccupation, c'est qu'on voit bien la réponse des syndicats au niveau de la Grande-Bretagne, qui est un pays fortement pollueur, mais face à des initiatives pareilles dans nos pays africains, quelle est la réponse à adopter? Et le cas précis que je voudrais évoquer, c'est qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, le gouvernement avait voulu, dans sa politique d'accroissement de l'économie, installer des centrales à charbon dans la région de San Pedro, qui est le deuxième pôle économique, afin de fournir en électricité les différentes unités industrielles. Mais ce projet de centrale à charbon a été combattu. Et finalement, après la COP26 à Glasgow, le gouvernement a décidé de remplacer ces centrales à charbon par 2 centrales à gaz. Et ici, on nous dit aussi que le gaz, pour le gouvernement, est une énergie propre et que cette énergie-là est moins polluante que le charbon. Alors, est-ce que nous, en tant que syndicat, vu que déjà en Côte d'Ivoire, on nous a montré que le ratio d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre par personne est de 0,2 tonnes, ce qui est loin de la moyenne mondiale. Est-ce qu'on doit s'opposer à ce genre d'initiative, vu que déjà le pays n'est pas trop pollueur et que la question de l'emploi est vraiment cruciale? Qu'est-ce que nous devons faire? Devons-nous forcément nous opposer ou laisser faire parce que vraiment le pays en a besoin pour son développement et créer de nouveaux emplois? Merci.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I mean, that again is an excellent question and is one of the dilemmas. And, you know, I appreciate it's very easy for me to sit here. I'm sitting here in London and in the UK and say, no, you shouldn't develop coal or gas, you know, particularly with the issues of employment and access to energy in many countries. So I think, you know, we have to, and as trade unionists, we have to work collectively to see and understand what are those challenges and how we can support, obviously, what needs to happen in some countries where it's very much seen, understandably, that some investment in fossil fuels is needed to aid development and for work. I'm not quite sure how we do that just now. I think that the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy Global South initiative is really going to be a great resource for having these discussions. And I think that's where we certainly need to have them, because I think even here, so you might have heard of some of the campaigns that we have, you know, Just Stop Oil, or, you know, Keep the Oil in the Soil, these nice titles. And whilst we don't fundamentally disagree with that, because that's obviously what we need to do in the context of climate change, we also do need to understand these other elements that go with it globally, that need to be addressed. And I'm very excited with the Global South initiative, because I think this can create a very rich and important discussion that we've even started to have here around these different challenges, because of course, certainly, you know, we don't want to start new fossil fuel projects, but then how do we deal with these very real, you know, development issues and employment issues and access to energy issues, and that we have to contend with as well. And how do we deal with, and which is very real, around issues of new neocolonialism around the renewables and extractive industries, because I know certainly the UK government its minerals and rare earth metal strategies is about securing resources for the UK, Europe, and obviously global north, and that again will be at the expense of the development of the global south, which, you know, we certainly don't want to be replicating. That models of our colonial and industrial history, you know, so we really urgently need to be having these conversations. So I very much hope that perhaps some of this could be brought further into courses like this, and opportunities like this, and other debates which we're having. And if you're not part of the Global South initiative for Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, I would very much recommend getting in touch with that, and can provide details about it, because I think that's where these important discussions can start to happen as well. Because I don't think, you know, we can't simply just say, no, you can't do this. We have to understand these things in a very detailed way. And of course, you know, many of you are sitting in countries which are on the front line of climate change and the impacts of climate change as well. So there's a very real issues around this. Thank you.
Merci une fois de plus, Sam, pour ces éléments de réponse. Peut-être on aimerait un peu savoir, pour peut-être conclure, ton mot de fin en ce qui concerne la question anti-fracking. Quel est le mot que tu peux donner aux différents syndicats ici présents pour pouvoir lutter contre ce phénomène aujourd'hui? Quel est ton mot de fin? Quelle est la démarche que les syndicats peuvent entreprendre pour lutter contre ce phénomène?
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I mean, one, and sort of probably going back to the real heart of the lecture and presentation, is really about building our alliances. And, you know, we came into an alliance with the environmental movement around fracking in the UK. It wasn't something started through the trade unions. And I think that has been very helpful for two reasons, and this is something which we've certainly built on over the years, is we need environmentalists to understand workers' concerns. And, you know, obviously, you know, and as workers and as trade unionists, we need to be working with environmentalists to understand their concerns. And I think it's only in building these alliances that we have a better opportunity to do this. And so when we had the climate change talks in Glasgow in Scotland last year, we spent 2 years, and one of that was obviously because of COVID, but building a very broad-based coalition So we called it the COP26 Coalition, which has now become the Climate Justice Coalition, of a multitude of different movements. So environmentalists, NGOs, faith groups, racial justice groups, social justice groups, trade unionists, and many different groups trying to bring people together to work with a common agenda, and central to that agenda is justice. And obviously, as trade unionists, that's at its heart, internationalism is at its heart, and solidarity is at the heart of it. And I think when we have these coalitions, it does help us to understand each other better and to support and reinforce the messages that we want to do. And I think that's been quite successful in the UK to some degree. And I think, we have to, there is a particular thing about fracking compared to other fossil fuel projects. And I think, just globally, it's really not going to be a game changer. And I think my concern is at the moment, and certainly this has happened in Europe with the energy crisis, and particularly because of the war in Ukraine and what's happened with gas, we've now seen a big shift away from the focus on renewable energy, and this new, as it said in the sort of presentation for this sort of new dash for gas on the back of this, and this is quite dangerous. And we really need to be focused obviously on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions, and making sure that we're rebuilding those multilateral institutions where we can do knowledge share and address those other issues which are going to be very prominent at the COP in a couple of weeks' time around climate financing, loss and damage, and reparations, and making sure money is going into those things, and our collaboration is going into that. Thank you.
Vraiment, une fois de plus, merci beaucoup, Sam Mason, pour ce temps que tu nous as donné de partager ensemble sur la question de la coalition travailliste anti-fracking au Royaume-Uni. C'était pour nous vraiment un réel plaisir de vous avoir pour partager ce savoir vraiment qui peut-être n'est pas connu par beaucoup, mais qui est vraiment profond aujourd'hui en ce qui concerne la question du climat et les effets de serre dans nos différentes communautés et peut-être dans le monde entier. Vraiment, nous disons merci une fois de plus pour le temps que tu as créé pour être avec nous. Je sais que vous avez un programme très chargé, mais vous avez tenu à être ici avec nous cet après-midi. Vraiment, nous disons merci une fois de plus. Et nos participants, on veut également vous dire merci d'avoir honoré notre invitation une fois de plus cet après-midi. Comme vous pouvez le remarquer au niveau de la conversation, vous avez le lien. Si vous voulez vous intéresser par le travail que Sam fait, vous pouvez suivre son lien, vous pouvez suivre le travail qu'elle mène avec son syndicat au quotidien pour pouvoir également apprendre des best practices. Donc, sentez-vous libre de copier ce lien qu'on a partagé. Juste en guise de conclusion, on aimerait vous dire que le 28 à la même heure, 14h, nous avons un autre atelier avec un autre expert du coup, qui est la personne de Silpa. Elle va nous entretenir sur le mouvement des pêcheurs et des paysans résistants à la politique des fleuves, à la pollution des fleuves en Inde. Donc, vraiment, inscrivez-vous également pour cet échange qui serait très enrichissant et nous espérons que vous avez passé un excellent moment parmi nous. On vous souhaite vraiment une belle semaine et merci une fois de plus d'avoir été parmi nous. Nous voulons dire merci à nos différents interprètes, Yannick qui était connecté et Clément. Nous disons merci également à la team de la Global Labour University qui était connectée avec nous. Nous avons Elira, nous avons Matidja, nous avons Shen, nous avons Yen, nous avons l'équipe de la FES, Shen, nous avons Catherine, nous avons Annette, dont nous leur disons merci beaucoup d'être avec nous cet après-midi. À nous voir vendredi une fois de plus pour une autre session très intéressante. Bye bye.